John Locke argued that a legitimate government is bound by standing laws, known rules, and accountability to the people, not by the will of those who hold power. When power no longer feels obligated to explain itself, the system hasn't just failed once. It has begun to change what it believes it is allowed to do. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's January 26, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Eric, I was going to kind of forgo banter this morning because some people that I really respect have suggested that they don't really like our banter. I think we're delightful, especially when I talk hoops. They just want to get to the stuff. And yay, I'm glad they like our stuff. And I really wanted to show that I can listen and change my behaviors. And that's what was my plan to do. Here's my little bit of a sop for those people is do note that in the show notes, we post with every episode a time sequencing of all the sections we talk about. So absolutely feel free to go to whatever section you most care about. That's why we put them there. And then the second, I'd like everyone to notice that I'm wearing a red shirt. It's red.
Nice. Yep. Keeping with your New Year's resolution.
Keep it with my New Year's resolution. And if you notice it, it's a Navy women's basketball shirt. So even though I didn't really want to talk about basketball, I do have to give a shout out to Navy Women's Hoops, who on Saturday sang second by winning the Army-Navy game 60-44 and securing first place in the Patriot League. Truth in advertising, and I'm sorry in advance about this, my teammates, I think I might even love Navy hoops more than Duke hoops. Can you believe that? And I think it's because, one, my daughter played there, and two, every player on the team has chosen to serve their turn for their country, and I'm always proud of those who make that choice. And then for the firsties on the team, Kelly Giuliani and Morgan Damos and Marin Laritas and Kate Sampson, who were there 4 years ago in their plebe year when they went 1-29. Way to lead. I know that year you all felt like you were failing, but you figured out that you were building, and look at what you've done. So to the team, to Coach Tim Cook, first in the Patriot League is pretty good. Keep the press.
Yeah. Go Navy, beat Army. That's huge for them at the start of their letter sweater. And for those boomers that are still listening to us and not able to skip ahead, we do go to the trouble to connect those, and very easy to skip ahead to the section that you're looking for. So happy if you're still here, want to warm up with us and get to know us a little bit more. But also, if you want to get to some of the meat and potatoes, that's why we do it.
Well, do you have anything you want to share now that I've consumed the air with my stuff?
Oh, yes. The air is cold. It is very cold. So hope everybody's staying warm and staying safe.
See, I like this. See, this is how you get to know us. Sue is wordy. Eric is to the point. Maybe one day we'll change this up and I'll say 3 words and you'll say 300. It'll be great.
I don't know. I got a bit of a soapbox coming up, so buckle up.
Hey, listen.
Yeah, what are we going to do today?
Yeah, about this episode, we're continuing to build on the first 3 segments of this year of geopolitics, trust, elections. And this week, we're going to try and put that all together into discussing power and precedent and accountability to explain the impact beyond the event. The short version of that, I'm channeling you, is each incident that we see matters, but the real danger is in the pattern and the precedent it sets. So we're going to try and continue our theme of lifting you all up so you can see what we see, benefit hopefully from the perspective we bring, and then know how you want to respond to it. Not the event, not the whipsaw, not the news with someone who's trying to tell you what to think, but rather just see the actual event, and then let's put it in some context.
Sounds good. Let's get into it. So we'll start today in Minnesota. 3 weeks after Renee Good was shot and killed in Minneapolis on January 7th by an ICE officer, another U.S. citizen, Alex Preddy, 37, was fatally shot on January 24th during a confrontation involving federal agents. In the immediate aftermath, DHS leadership publicly described him as a dangerous threat and asserted he intended to harm agents, while emerging bystander video shares a very different story. We decided to talk about it here on UI because the intelligence question isn't just what happened, it's what institutions are being asked to do, what incentives and messagings are being set from the top, and what predictable outcomes follow. There are so many implications for the rule of law, how we hold each other accountable in a society, and how it is drawing much of our attention inward. But Sue, I wanted to start by asking you, as a former intelligence officer, if you turn the map around, so to speak, and imagine yourself creating an intelligence analysis from another country, what would you be highlighting and gaps that you'd be looking to exploit?
So the intelligence officer in me, not the policy advisor, but the intelligence officer, looking at what's going on in the US right now and the conversations we're having, I think I'd say, man, if the US isn't broken, it's surely on its way to it. I don't say that to choose a side in which way it's going, but one of the most important things about America has been that we have been reliable, certainly since World War II, where
Yeah.
we're kind of the stability of free and open systems. The rule of law is what allows people to do things with us, to trust that there is a process here that is going to make what we do fit within some rules that we have set. Now, remember, we can change the rules as long as we do that openly and people know they've been changed. So the biggest thing I'd take away is that the US is broken or breaking. And either way, I can't treat it as though it is what it used to be. Even if I continue to do business with it, which I will because we're powerful and important and all that kind of stuff, but I'd be looking at my strategy for interaction based on the fact that I see massive divisions, massive uncertainty, and lots of unrest. Not to put too fine a point on it, is we love sitting here in the US talking about Iran where the government is killing civilians, and oh my God, we can't stand that in protests.
Right.
I don't know if I'm in Iran and I'm looking at the US, what am I seeing right now? So I just think it's not just what they're seeing and how I don't care what they think of us. It matters. It matters for global stability and all the people that are counting on it. And you're going to see people deciding that they've got to adjust based on it. So that's one. Also, that's how are people going to use it and deal with this on the up and up?
Right.
Let's talk about adversaries who would advance their interests at the expense of ours. I just remind people about information operations. We talked about this certainly with Russians' attempts to influence the US elections, and that is doctrinally the Soviet Union is about undermining democracy, especially that which is practiced by the US. Well, man, you have got a great opportunity here looking at just what we're doing to use information operations to sow distrust, to create divisions by the insertion of information that amplifies one or both sides just to create more chaos, more breakage, more pressure, more protests, less certainty, less in our position, bring us more into question. So I will say that if you're an adversary with intention to undermine what we are doing to ourselves, and with the advent of a digital world, which I talk about all the time, we still seem to forget how that can be misused. Just remember that those who would do us harm are using the digital space to foment this and can create something that appears to buttress one side or the other of any argument for the purpose of making us not believe first in each other and then in ourselves.
Yeah.
We're going to talk later in the episode about Davos, which is about what's kind of the mirror of what's going on internally and the impact on friends and allies. But just looking at us and how others see us and how they would use us, I think the information space is the new battlefield.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only are you competing with the algorithm, providing information that shows up to you more easily, because generally speaking, we'll take the easiest route, but also how we respond just as a government, not just from the leadership perspective, but also Congress, how they operate, how they respond to things, just the whole system and how we work.
Yeah, on the one hand, you can shape it, and the other hand, you can figure out how far you can go based on our national ability or willingness to respond. It gives people power.
Exactly. I also want to talk about the leadership failure from the top. We've talked about it before. There's the terrible crisis management, either being fed inaccurate information initially or them just flippantly briefing it with limited information, wanting to get information out there early. Because no one wants to hear, we're gathering all the information, we'll conduct an investigation, etc. But making assertions and immediately pointing outside the organization is worse when you have to walk it back later. We'll talk next about the respect that I have for ICE and Customs and Border Patrol individually. And ICE's job is inherently hard. Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO, is responsible for arrest, detention, and removals. And for years, key part of that has been fugitive and absconder work with stated priority for people who present public safety or national security risk. But after the second Trump administration came into office, ICE has gotten a lot more attention. In FY 2025, Congress appropriated about $10 billion for ICE and $20 billion for Customs and Border Patrols. Then in July, with the passage of the Big Beautiful Bill and Reconciliation Law, they added roughly $75 billion for ICE and $65 billion for Customs and Border Patrol in multi-year enforcement funding. By early January 2026, ICE was reported as employing more than 22,000 officers and agents. That's up from 10,000 when President Trump took office a year ago, about a 120% increase. And so specifically wanted to talk about the narratives and metrics here. And in complex systems, you tend to get what you ask for. We've talked about that before with Secretary Hegseth and some of the things he's asking for in the Department of Defense.
Yeah, when you want it bad, you tend to get it that way.
Exactly. I assess that when you run out of significant national security risks for those people to target, that's when you start targeting the house cleaning crew, strawberry pickers, and Home Depot parking lots to try to achieve those metrics that have been pushed down from higher end quotas. So, Sue, when leadership sets pressure signals like this surge language, looking for big arrest numbers and quotas, what are the predictable second and third order effects that we should expect trying to hit these numbers?
Yeah, I think you articulated it really well. And that is the influx of resources puts demands, the addition of humans. If you give humans a job, they're going to want to do it. If you don't prescribe it, they will expand to fill the space that they have. And you may think I'm talking about ICE, but one of the things that I've answered to in my career was the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created post 9/11 to integrate the intelligence community so that we were better able to share information, have common policies, and hopefully not have that kind of failure again. 15 years later, one of the things that every leader has been trying to address is the fact that we created an agency, we put a lot of people in, and then we said, go do this broad job. And in fact, people expand to fill the roles that they're given. And it isn't
Yeah.
necessarily malfeasance. It's just that they're going to do it. And in a bureaucracy, what you get is too much bureaucracy, right? Too many rules, too much oversight. In the case we're talking about with jobs that carry massive weight and lethality and responsibility, the way it works is people think that they have the power without necessarily the time to be inculcated into the rules and procedures and culture that will let them execute it appropriately. I mean, Eric, think about how much time and how many years have gone into training military officers, right? All the things that prescribe it and define it, all the things that you were taught from the day that you entered the military in and how we do things. And it takes a long time,
Yeah.
right? And it feels like we are taking that authority and giving it to people that we are not investing in. And then at a moment of failure, we're stuck with, oh my gosh, how do we hold this accountable? And whose responsibility is it? An individual? I guess an individual is always responsible. But what I think you and I agree on is this is a leadership moment. And I think there are lots of leadership moments here. Number one is just everyone who's looking at what's going on, particularly in Minnesota, but it's not the only place. This isn't good. You don't even have to talk about who's at fault to say this cannot be the way it's going to go.
Right.
And so how do you look at that event and say, what are the things that need to be done about it? The interesting thing is if leadership doesn't see it, recognize with intention is not yielding the outcome you need, when does it step in and say, we need to do this differently? How can you change? And I just don't see any evidence yet that the leadership is doing that. Leadership can't, in failure, give justifications or excuses. It has to explain what's going on. And it is only in that explanation, generally should be done ahead of time, that you can find the resolution that isn't just either swept on the rug or then explodes into other parties thinking they have to do something about it. That's why I say it's a leadership issue, and it has nothing to do with who's at fault. It has everything to do with who has the power, who's making the decisions, and what the environment, the situation is that just isn't tenable. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's challenging to scale any organization, whether that's in
Yeah.
business as you start to increase your number of stores or your number of personnel. Same thing with this organization. I think that's been one of the challenges is they've gotten a lot of money, big influx.
Yep.
They've gotten a lot more personnel. You got a lot of new folks, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the individuals and the leadership needs to be held accountable, and how you address these situations and handle these situations really sets the temperature and whether you're de-escalating or escalating the situation. And I think we've seen a lot of these examples. We can look across the world and across history, right? History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does certainly rhyme.
I know because we cite certain examples and they are under a certain administration that some can think that what we're trying to talk about is a political view of policies or actions based on which side we're on. This, to me, isn't about sides, and it's not about rights because we all have the same one. It's about whether power is abusing privilege, and I'm serious about that being destructive for our nation. But if you want an example, I will say post 9/11 surveillance and detention was in a way an abuse of power. Now, we justified it in terms of terrorists, and we didn't know who was coming to the country. We needed to find it. We just been attacked, and we just left the World Trade Center and thousands of people and all this kind of stuff. But the way we prosecuted that in many ways instilled a long-term distrust in intel and law enforcement. It did lead to legal reforms, but we're still feeling the effects of that distrust. So if you
Yeah.
think we're just picking on this event because it happens to be with an administration, I will tell you it's always bad. I mean, the Great Purge of Stalin in 36 to 7, right? It's not the same. It was much more physical repression, but it was an early dangerous echo of the same logic, and that is their loyalty tests and institution intimidation. So I just feel like I need to say there have been other examples of this independent of this particular administration, and we see how it goes.
Great similarity there between 9/11. I mean, I don't have any numbers on what the personnel plus up was in the intelligence community. The military certainly plussed up, but definitely a situation of throwing a lot of money at a problem and scaling quickly. So some similarities there.
And I don't think there was a single person that thought they were doing the wrong thing. It's just the escalation of government privilege tends to be problematic. And power in general wants to do it, which is why you have to have oversight and tension. And here's the rub. Part of the oversight intention is that which is affected by Congress, and part of the oversight intention is that which is affected by the American people. How do we keep those in check so they keep on putting pressure on our system to live up to our ideals
Yeah.
rather than going, nah, we're just going to pursue it. There aren't any easy fixes right now.
What levers do you like, right? There's been calls for bring Secretary Noem before Congress to ask her questions. There's articles of impeachment potentially, or even the latest has been not funding the Department of Homeland
Yeah.
Security through the most recent funding bill. I've got some concerns with that because DHS is much bigger than just Customs and Border Patrol and just ICE. So what do you think is going to be the most effective way forward?
I think we're well beyond calling in the heads of the agencies. They have been. They were before they were selected. They were not truthful in their answers as evidenced by their actions. They've been called in since, and they've been basically told the American people by way of their representatives, I don't have to answer to you. And then you see this now. So I don't think hearings on the matter, calling them in, are going to be enough. A real investigation of what's going on writ large. I mean, there's just Minnesota, but then there are other things, and then the decision whether those people can stay in their jobs. And even though they're presidentially appointed, they were Senate confirmed times past for hearing, even though how we effect accountability has to be public and transparent and explained. Boy, it is true that Congress has the power of the purse, and it really is the best one they have, since the likelihood that we can make laws fast enough to change any situation is 2, and Slim just walked out the door. Be careful with that one. You need to be more surgical. I think Congress writ large, all the members have to take some lessons out of the shutdown before and say, no, 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 we as a bipartisan group are going to take the issue that we think is most problematic. In this case, I'll say CBP and ICE, and hold that piece of the budget, but not just do broad agency-wide that is gonna have a huge effect downstream, and then will become a political football where the accusation of you're just doing that to do that will just
Right.
be so
Yeah.
profound. The actions that our government writ large needs to affect are much more surgical and much more definitive because we now have enough of a body of evidence to know how these leaders see their authority. And if that authority is outside, and remember we have this Constitution thing, and there are a lot of amendments that prescribe what legitimate actions are and not. If they're going to do the government's job writ large, they're gonna have to be surgical, and they're gonna have to be meaningful and willing to stand up in a bipartisan way. I hope we're on the way there. We haven't seen much of evidence of it yet. I love the point about resources when untethered from doctrine and training and direction can go horribly, horribly wrong. Watch out for people who want to give you money to solve their problems. And I have experienced it myself that when you take money from the government, the very next thing the government wants is to know how you've spent it. And so
Yeah.
just the pressure, "Yay, I got the money. It's gonna take me 3 years to scale up to do this." And there's no, you a month is gone, you a twelfth of the money needs to be gone. And
And what's the ROI on it? What have we
right.
gotten from that first dollar spent? I think it's a tough environment for these men and women who are serving this mission. And that's why I want to separate some of the respect for the people doing the hard job and the scrutiny of these incentives and messaging that's coming from the top. It's one of the themes we've echoed in previous episodes, the respect and appreciation for frontline workers. I previously served in reserves with a Marine whose day job was with Customs and Border Patrol, and he was serving high risk warrants. Very dangerous job, kicking in doors of drug smugglers and people associated with cartels who were pretty bad dudes. What many military members signed up to do with an intent of going overseas, so we keep that type of threat away from our families here at home, not in San Diego, California. But we also signed up to peaceably protest and protect that right for all Americans and to be able to say things that we disagree with. But some of the way that these agents are being treated reminds me a little bit of the troops returning from Vietnam back in the late 60s. You can disagree with the war and you can disagree with the policy, but thousands of agents signed up before 2025 in this surge with an optimism I have to imagine to try and keep their families and this country safe. Patriotic, well-intentioned, good people who deserve our respect and not to be spit on or yelled at. They're doing a tough job. But the institution and leadership is failing them in both policy, narrative, and response, I think. They need to be held accountable for their actions, but I think we all need to take a second and appreciate the personal risk and job that many of them do to keep us safe.
I hear you. I love public servants. You just heard me start by talking about Navy women's basketball, and one of the reasons why I love service academy sports is just because the and they've chosen to serve their country. I'm old enough to remember Vietnam that you described. I saw that. Friends of my family came back from a war their country sent them to only to be the target of people's ire. I'm also young enough to have experienced anonymous hatred delivered digitally and how destructive that can be. So you are not wrong that we need to remember not to paint everything with an ugly brush. I'm horrified about what happened in Minnesota anew over the
Mhm.
weekend because I think we do see what happened. But I will say that if you're someone who's looking at videos, there are videos out there where you see a very respectful officer saying, "Ma'am, step back," or "I need this." And even before they can say anything, they're just being verbally attacked. And then it's just escalated into if they are physical, then they're enduring physical attacks. So this just it can't work. I will say, Eric, that on the Minnesota one, and here's one of the problems, I think protest is one of the things that the people say that they are holding their government accountable, and I want peaceful protest. But in this last case, I confess that I would probably step in front of someone who is being pushed to the ground. Just as you've heard me on this podcast try and step in front of my intelligence colleagues who have been penalized for just doing their job, or the civil service who's been labeled with the corrupt badge. So I think one of the middle things that's the hardest is, when do you step in and when do you just let it go, and where do you find that balance? So here's my advice to Congress. Number one, this is because the precipitating action is governmental. And we have this amazing government that was set up with three branches to put tension on each other to assure accountability. If I were talking to Congress, I'd say, oh, remember that you're oversight. You've done it before. Do it again. I've been hauled in front of Congress for things that I have done as an intelligence officer. And I would love to say, hey, I've got a hard job. You can't expect me to get it right. But that accountability is still important. So my first would be to Congress, do your job, especially of oversight. And then to the executive branch is, you have to allow it. Because in part, that oversight is an element of your authority. And if you wanted to maintain it for the long time, you have to participate in that system. This using our whole of government system, the executive branch that sets the policy, the congressional part that sets oversight, and the collective that says we're trying to maintain rule of law so that the country goes forward. What's needs to be happened. To the organizations involved, and I take your point about how new they are and how beefy they got fast. I think this is just one of those cases where you just have to double down on training. And whether you're goaded or not, a citizen saying something to you is very different than what you can do to the citizen when you decide to respond. It's just the responsibility of power. And so I do think that the organization, from just straight leadership, quit jumping to statements about the intent of the parties too early, because it is just as wrong to say that the people, the victims involved, the people involved in the circumstance are domestic terrorists, as it is to say that they were fearing for their life. You don't know about any of those things. So stop that stuff. But within the organizations themselves, clearly they're over their skis. And I don't mean that I can't know what direction they're given, but if you just look at it, and one of the ways that you protect your officers is by doubling down on the training. And then to the people are America. I feel really strongly about exercising our rights. I think if you think that there's something wrong, I think you do have to exercise your voice. There's a lot of good words in the peaceful protests. The day before the shooting, or 2 days before the shooting, there was a massive protest in Minnesota. There were just people marching and there were no arrests.
Yeah.
There was no violence. So for the people, yes, you're the country. You're the voice. You can't wait every 4 years to have something to say, but peaceful is really important. And remember, you aren't the judge and jury either. So there you go.
Yep. That's a good point. I feel like I'm establishing a new theme here of what I'm teaching my children, but certainly want to teach them they're always entitled to the right to self-defense, and that they have a responsibility to help those who can't help themselves or defend those who can't defend themselves. You never know how you're going to respond in one of those moments, but I think many of us can see ourselves in that gentleman's shoes. Not just taking issue with the leadership at the top of Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol, but also some of the framing and selective information that leadership takes, but also the media and people and throughout the government and country. And in moments like this, unfortunately, we see outrage turned into principle, and people fall into the consistency trap, recycling the same arguments depending on whose side benefits. So how do you approach this information, and how do you analyze it yourself, combating against your own preconceived notions, right? Because we all have inherent bias and ideas, and also against your previous worldview when some of this information and events unfold.
All right, here's how I do it. The first is, I remember that in our environment, just because they say it's news, it's kind of like a documentary isn't true just because it's bad, black and white. Everything that gets presented to you that is trying to shape how you think is something that you should examine for yourself. not what you should think about it, but start like an intelligence officer in terms of what is. Be inductive about this. Intelligence is all about looking at what is and then trying to understand what that means. Deductive is I need to prove a theory of the case. So much of what we get is someone trying to get us to agree to an agenda by the way the information is presented. So what I would say first is just look at what is. Eschew anything that's trying to tell you what to think, and then do your own hunting for information that lets you better understand that. And when you do that, you're going to see every argument, including the why do you have a gun there? And the he can have a gun, right? So start with just the facts of the case and then run a quick who benefits from this and what principle is being applied? Consistency. Again, choosing just this event, most fascinating thing to me, and one of the things that sends me over the edge is intellectual dishonesty. So Alex Pretty couldn't have a gun, even though it was holstered and he was registered to have it. But Kyle Rittenhouse in 2020 could go to a protest with an AR-15 that wasn't registered to him and shoot people, but that was his legal right to carry a gun. But now this guy should have known better. So again, look for those things that whether the right is being applied consistency rather than it's being applied based on your perspective. Be careful of people using the same arguments. When you start hearing the same arguments over and over again, I think you and I were talking the other day. One of the things that vexes me the most about where our political system right now is we keep having these party line votes. How is it possible that every member of Congress, based on the party they're in, thinks that each bill is either right and wrong? That just seems insane to me that every single person would have the same argument. So the other one is when you're listening to things, just be careful of repetitive arguments and just thinking that because you hear it a lot, let's see what is, and then let's try and understand what's happening. And that's how you're going to see the pattern, the precedent. Because those of us on the outside just are not going to be able to get inside to know everything about it, but you can seek to understand what's being said. And which is why one of the most important things for a government to do is to explain what they're doing, not justify what they're doing. Because if they'll explain it, we have more opportunity to understand it. And if you justify it, you kind of come down to saying, which side do I like?
And that's how you take the information that you receive and how you analyze it, and it becomes intelligence for you, right? And one of the goals that we're trying to do here is just present a different option and a different way of looking at things and asking the question. And I'm going to drop a second dad theme here in as many segments, but you can always ask why. And it's not just because I said so. Always ask the question of why.
Yeah, and your why and why I'm doing that, especially the more power you have, that really needs to be addressed ahead of time. After the fact, just human nature, it calls that into question. And so let's go with some non-Minnesota examples. I think the federal government needs to explain whether Taiwan is a national interest or not. Because if for some reason there's a crisis there and the shooting war starts, man, it'll be too late to explain what our action is. So you got to have these discussions ahead of time about what the basis for your actions will be. In this digital world, statute and policy won't create enough guidelines on how to protect data and how to use AI. So if you are a producer or user of tools and data, you better have your own ethic around how you bound use that is articulatable before you get into a problem. So the idea of why is good, but it's why when. I think that is super important the more power you have, because as soon as an event happens, you're now a party to it.
Yeah, and that's the value of precedent too, right? And establishing. So we've got the written laws, and then we've also had the historical interpretation of those laws, how they've been ruled upon by the judiciary, and the way we conduct ourselves. This question of federal versus local authority and the idea of unraveling. We've already talked a little bit about federal and local authority, but you had an appearance on MS Now's Deadline with Nicole Wallace last Friday. Great segment for those who want to go back and listen to it or watch it. And one of the things Nicole brought up with you was this article by David Brooks, where he's talking about we're in the middle of at least 4 unravelings. First, the unraveling of the post-war international order. Second, the unraveling of domestic tranquility, wherever immigration customs enforcement agents bring down their jackboots. Three, the further unraveling of the democratic order with attacks on Fed independence, excuse the pun, trumped up prosecutions of political opponents, he writes. And finally, unraveling of President Trump's mind. So I'd like to forego the discussion of the fourth. We'll leave that with Mr. Brooks.
Not there, so I'm not going to say.
But what is your reaction to this unraveling idea and also the precedents that are being set in the federal-local relationship? This is through funding leverage, the idea of sanctuary designations and delegation programs. We can talk state capitalism, government investment in private companies. Intel got kicked in the pants last week with their earnings call after the government's investment in Intel taking that 10% stake. But which of those precedents are most likely to outlast this moment, Sue, and to be used in a future administration?
Let's allow that the environment in which we're trying to affect our constitutional republic has changed. Let's assert we have the same ideals. Let's acknowledge that the environment has changed such that the way in which we have affected those are no longer working, and that now can either show unraveling, or I guess it could be purposeful change. I think it's more likely that it's unraveling. And then when that happens, when those structures you created in order to create the nation that you intended against an environment that no longer exists, you have to reimagine how you do that. And if you don't do that, and if you don't address it with all the levers of power, what you end up is whoever happens to be sitting at that moment and however much they decide to use, the system is pretty powerless if it decides to lean into one direction or another. So before we jump to just saying that one administration or another is bad, let's just admit that the environment has changed and we've got to figure out how to do this nation against the same ideals, which I think is the right thing to do, in a different way than we've done before, just accounting for a digital environment and the movement of information and the economic connectedness we have. So that's one. Against that backdrop of all the things that you've talked about, what is going to most likely cause us to stop believing in ourselves, which, by the way, is the worst thing that can happen to us? If the United States stops believing in itself, that is the big threat. And we see our adversaries trying to promulgate that. First thing that has to happen, and we talked about in the last episode, disproportionate action is bad. The idea that if you're my friends or you can help me, that you have a different outcome, a different set of rules, that is so breathtakingly undermining. Because now there's no way to see what's happening. There's no way for anyone to participate because no one understands the rule except for privilege. And again, executive orders aren't new, but an executive branch that decides because it got elected, it can wield power however it wants, particularly disproportionately. I think if it is not corrected, if we don't address it, if we don't talk about it as a nation and how really terrible that is, that's something that could persist. You hear the voices now saying, yeah, when we get in power, watch what we do. You heard President Trump say this after his 2020 loss. So this idea of disproportionate benefit based on personal relationship is so hard to undo, so hard for the system to see, and would really, quite frankly, throw us right back into patronage and even worse than that. The state's authority and responsibility is one that I think needs to be really fought hard for right now. And what's nice about that fight is it's within a system and a structure that we know. But remember that the Constitution says that any power that is not explicitly given to the federal government belongs to the state. That doesn't mean that if the Constitution is mute, the federal government can assert it. No, if it is mute, the states have it. And so whether it's gerrymandering, whether it is demanding that states turn over voter rolls, whether it's the state authorities don't have any right to the investigation that happens in their state, whether it is the federal government deciding what AI rules are going to be in various states, we really need to look at the modern construct of states' rights, federal rights, and how important that tension, how you affect it now, because that's one, if it's undone, that'll be really hard to do. And I think a piece of both of those is election stuff, because as we talked about in the last episode, and that is if elections stop becoming infrastructure but become contextual. In other words, I believe in the election, if it yields who I want, then that process doesn't allow any of those other things to happen. So I think election integrity and trust is really important. And then the last is what we see effectively being tributes, which is people figuring out that if they give money, they get something for them kind of off the books. Whether that is the Council of Peace and $1 billion. Wait, is that the United States setting up the Council of Peace? Is that Donald Trump setting up the Council of Peace? Where does the $1 billion go? How does it get used? Do we still have appropriations? How do the American people decide how that happens? So this notion of if I have money, I can get something. And that includes down to the corporate level that you mentioned, which is I want preferential FTC adjudication.
Yeah.
So I'll give a portion of something to something. It's the act of that happening that is problematic. And we should look at it anytime it's happening. And it did not start today, but it is accelerating, maybe in part because the environment is harder to oversee. Maybe it's because we've moved from kind of pluralism, like the society is important and we subordinate our rights, to one which is just I want this, I want this, I want this, and we now have a government that says, "Oh, I'll give you what you want." And it all works out for you if you can pay for it. So, I think those are probably the four that I think if we don't tackle them now when they are so in evidence and do so in a kind of whole of government, whole of society way, we're going to pay for that over and over.
Because why would an executive want to give up more power or more authority, right? It makes their job easier.
Right.
But the tension between the states and the federal government is one of the real successes of our system. And this idea of competition is what our country and what our economy and what our really idea of democracy and capitalism, foundationally capitalism, this idea of competition and the best rising to the top is
Yep.
really what's made us successful.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in almost our first episode, where one of the things that gives me the most confidence and source of optimism is this tension that we have uniquely here between democracy and capitalism, right? And they press on each other, and if one gets too powerful, the other one kind of falls off. But when those two things are in perfect concert, we do some really amazing things. And I think that's a tension. Again, tension isn't bad.
Some other tension happened at Davos last week, the World Economic Forum, where President Trump publicly ruled out using military force with Greenland, and he backed off the threatened tariffs aimed at pressuring European countries over the issue initially. He later escalated pressure on Canada in public messaging, including warning of a 100% tariff tied to Canada's China posture. But the NATO country leadership's response, I think, was the bigger takeaway from Davos. UK Prime Minister Starmer responded that President Trump should apologize for his false assertion that troops from non-US NATO countries avoided the front lines during the Afghanistan war, describing Trump's remarks as insulting and frankly appalling. President Trump made a comment that he wasn't sure the other 31 nations in NATO would be there to support the United States if and when they were requested. In an interview with Fox Business News from Davos, he said, quote, they'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that, and they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines. That is not the firsthand accounts that I have heard from individuals who have been there. Starmer also paid tribute to the 457 British personnel who died and also to those who have been left with profound lifelong injuries. He also had a new subtle toughening in his message, mostly only detected in the UK press, but worth mentioning. Canada's Prime Minister, Carney, argued that global order has ruptured and that great powers are increasingly using tariffs, finance, and supply chains as tools of coercion, a call for middle powers to coordinate and reduce vulnerability. So Starmer and Carney weren't ad-libbing. Those lines were carefully constructed by career diplomats and statesmen, as I believe you've called them before, Sue. What can we infer about their threat perceptions and the red lines from what they chose to say and how they chose to say it?
Davos was a signal event, not a gaffe. People come there to listen to leaders and to talk economics. And on the one hand, it didn't disappoint. On the other hand, it did present information that was stark, and I think from our allies and partners, particularly almost confirmatory of the direction that we're going. So if you think about the last year, a lot of tariffs, tariff walkbacks, a lot of bold statements, stark statements. We know who President Trump is. If you're a fan, you like, oh, I love his realness. And if you're like me, you're like, oh my God, do you not understand the weight your words carry? But in that event, for those people, in the culmination of a year of just whipsaw effect, the statements by Carney and Starmer, you're exactly right. They weren't ad-libbing. They were statesmanlike, but behind the scenes, in order to be able to say the things they did, to be able to publicly risk the ire of the United States, but even more importantly, to openly create distance amongst the greatest alliance that history has ever known. They just wouldn't do that casually. What it means is that they've lost all the behind the scenes stuff. They've lost the opportunity to say, yeah, I know there's this chop of politics, but below that, don't worry, we have a stability that we can count on each other. Their statements reveal that they no longer believe that that infrastructure that is the backbreaking physical labor of national and global security, they think is ruptured. And now what they believe they have to do is they have to send their own signaling about the line that they're not going to cross. So, man, just because we have a president who will say things casually then walk them back, I encourage you not to misunderstand that those leaders would never do something casually. And it means behind the scenes, they're doing a lot of preparing for other arrangements that will allow their nation to survive successfully. I 100% agree with the point that the world order that has existed for the longest time is no longer in place. I don't know if that means we're headed to any kind of Armageddon, but I do think that there is now real question about whether the part of the world order that was anchored by the United States and represented free and open societies, including freedom of trade, freedom of movement, all those sorts of things, we haven't established it, right? It's now in real question. And the willingness of these leaders to say it, I think, is a huge signal that trust has been lost with them. Because if it were just perturbed, I don't think they would have said it. And just remember, you can't surge trust in a crisis. And it oftentimes is the U.S. that needs help from these same allies and partners. So I think it's big. I think it's a big signal. Does it mean it's irrecoverable? No. Does it mean it's serious and it represents a whole lot more than just some press conference language? Yeah, it does.
Separate from Davos, Denmark's military intelligence service released an annual outlook that for the first time explicitly assessed the U.S. as a potential threat, citing growing uncertainty and coercive dynamics. You may recall from episode 8 of the Understandable Insights podcast back in September, we talked about Danish officials summoned senior U.S. diplomats over reports of U.S. intelligence collection and alleged covert influence operations related to Greenland.
You know, it's a big old goofy world now. I don't know that we've talked about here on Understandable Insights, but one of the least known functions of the intelligence community is that it has a lot of relationships with foreign intelligence services, all of them, as a matter of fact. And throughout history, that channel has been used to have candid conversations, whether that is to express discontent or to make offer. And that the Danes would go public and say they think the U.S. is a security risk, rather than say what the Germans did post 9/11 that says, hey, bucko, what are you doing spying on allies? Below the surface is, I think, a pretty stark thing that the Danes would call out a longstanding partner that has been this third rock of world order and call him a security risk publicly. I'm surprised. And again, maybe that's where the world is going to turn, right? There are no secrets anymore. Secrecy doesn't have the same leverage and advantage it used to have. But I will still say for these nations to come that boldly out publicly and say these things, I think is a signal that
Yeah.
we are losing their trust, and that will have consequence.
Yeah, even if it's an OSINT world, this is still unprecedented, and those channels have been extremely important for diplomacy. It's part of the reason probably our intelligence agencies nest themselves within the State Department abroad, right? Because that's another avenue of diplomacy and communication, even when some of the more formal channels break down.
Same thing. How we do what we do will necessarily change. That we have to have some basic tenets of how we behave so that we can be trusted in order to lead the free world that benefits as we do from that alliance. You got to find a way to achieve the same effect, albeit differently. And I think we're struggling with that.
Our goal was to talk about how each incident matters, but that the real danger is the pattern and the precedent it sets. What do you want folks to walk away from this episode believing?
I think accountability is not optional. It is, in fact, for our kind of government, the source of legitimacy. Because I said so, just it doesn't work for parents and it doesn't work for a nation. It doesn't work if power acts first and explains later. It just doesn't. That whole notion of you can't surge trust in a crisis,
Mhm.
you build that ahead of time. Precedent is set by what we excuse, not by what we celebrate. And power has to be defensible regardless of who is affected.
Precedent is set by what we excuse, not what we celebrate. Well, what are you watching?
Kind of relevant to this episode, what the state of Minnesota does. Does it kind of says, no, we're an important part of our national structure. And so we have to, even though it's hard for us, we have to stand up and do what we're supposed to do. I've been on this bandwagon and maybe I can become so annoying to all our listeners that they'll turn around and call Congress and say, for God's sake, do your job so that Sue will shut up.
Or she's going to talk about more basketball.
Or she's going to talk more about exactly curses. But I'm watching what Congress does. And I thought you made the really good point is, yes, they have the power of the purse. Yes, they've used it effectively before. But if they make a mistake in how they use that, rather than sending a message and standing on unified bipartisan strength, because some of the things going on right now, if you're benefiting, you can think that it's okay, but look at it in terms of right versus privilege, and I think you'll come to a different thing. So I'm watching what Congress does. And I guess I'm watching what the people do, kind of my three levers of power. Can they find a way to exert pressure and exercise voice? And I think I heard Scott Galloway say this on his Pivot podcast with Kara Swisher. And he said, protests are great, but he's not sure that this administration lives them. But, if everyone decided that they would stop spending money on consumer goods, that would send a message that would change the administration's thinking. We saw it with Greenland and what the stock market did. So it'll be interesting to see what the people do. But seriously, individual attacks on individual incidents are unlikely to make a big difference. Keep exercising your voice. Keep filming because that's okay. But let's think about ways that are likely to be successful to make the change. And then the last is the talk of the Insurrection Act hasn't gone away, and I'm looking to see whether that talk cools down towards some of the solutions that we've suggested, or whether that is a choice that would be made to just say, because I said so. So I'm watching the Insurrection Act. How about you?
Iran's crackdown and some of their lethal response to their protests is worth watching. The Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is steaming west. They're on their way from the Pacific. One of the stated reasons for lack of military action initially was lack of resources in the Gulf. And so we'll see what comes of that. And then also this Greenland deal framework that's still coming out. It was talked about after the initial speech in Davos, but what does that framework actually entail? U.S. is getting all the authorities that Denmark and Greenland are still going to be sovereign. Like what exactly is in this deal that we have the framework for now and how that plays out? I'm watching those.
Yeah, those are good. I just one more show announcement from us. There are a lot of other issues that affect national and global security. We've not talked technology in the longest time, so I think maybe next episode or the next few episodes, we'll talk a bit about what's going on with industry and technology in advance and try and do the same thing that we're doing with these, which is rather than each of the individual deals, what we're seeing in terms of the signal those actions are setting. I think we just didn't feel like we could let this episode go without talking about Minnesota and Davos.
Yep. Pretty big moment. That's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or federal government, but in its people.
So thanks for joining us. We're so excited to be with you for a second year. We'd love to hear what you think of both our direction, focus, and insights. It's a conversation that we want, even though your adulation is always nice to have. So join us each week for Understandable Insights podcast. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another now more than ever. Thanks for listening.